Iran and Russia appear to be closer than ever before at a time when Donald Trump is pushing to reset the world order. But are things as they seem? Russia has offered to be a mediator between the US and Iran on potential nuclear talks. At the same time, there's been trilateral talks in Beijing between Russia, Iran, and China, again focused on Tehran's nuclear program. The meeting came days after the three countries held naval drills in the Gulf of Oman. So, what is the Kremlin's endgame with Iran? On today's episode, we're joined by Free Press reporter Tanya Lukyanova, who was born and raised in Moscow, where she reported for The New Yorker and The Wall Street Journal. She was also a producer on the Oscar-winning documentary Navalny.
Yes, if they picked Israel over Iran as their guest, honorary guest during the upcoming celebrations, then for sure, symbolically, it is, at least a PR opportunity for Putin to appear next to Netanyahu or whoever comes from the Israeli delegation and say, look, we are, having a dialogue with international partners. And again, Israel is a major ally of the U.S. So perhaps that's also a message to broader Western society to take stock of Russia's different position and differing positions on the world stage.
I'm Negar Moshehedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Tanya Lukyanova from the Free Press joins us now. Thank you so much for being here, Tanya.
Thank you so much for having me, Negar, and for pronouncing my last name so beautifully.
As a Moshehedi, I understand, and it's important to get the last name right. Tanya, as a reporter and as someone who not only was born in Russia and grew up in Russia, but also reported from there, what is your sense of the mood in Russia right now when it comes to Iran? And of course, we know that Moscow has offered up to be mediators between the U.S. and Iran should there be any talks on the nuclear front.
Right. Well, there is no one set mood inside the country. What we can glimpse of in terms of, Russian attitude mostly comes from the state media and whatever official statements are being made. It appears to be that Russia-Iran ties have really improved rapidly since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, when Iran became a major player and a major partner for Russia that had suddenly found itself isolated from the West. And it found itself needing not only Iranian equipment and war technology like its drone weapons and missiles, but also, Iran became a key strategic player for Russia for evading sanctions and for imports and exports that have been put under sanctions by the Western governments. So, starting from 2022, the Russia-Iran ties, rapidly, grow closer. Right now, the situation has somewhat changed. It appears to be the case that Russia is no longer as interested in Iranian military assistance as the situation on the front lines in Ukraine is changing, as the geopolitical situation is also changing with the ceasefire announced by the U.S. and Ukraine after holding joint talks in Saudi Arabia yesterday. Obviously, the ceasefire negotiations hinge on Russia accepting that deal, but everything points towards the fact that, um, you know, Donald Trump coming to the White House is appears to be the closest that the U.S. has ever come to have Russia as an ally, quote unquote. So it appears that, the ties. One of the people that I spoke to from Russia, when I was asking them about the kind of like what is the attitude, called this kind of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine a partnership of convenience, so that the two countries sort of view each other with a little bit of suspicion, but also are willing to partner on strategic, um, you know, on case by case on basis when the need arises. So I would say that, at least from the Russian standpoint, that need arose sharply in 2022, and it appears to be somewhat waning now in 2025.
So do the Russians not in that sense, trust the Iranians if they have such a great suspicion? And do they feel like the Russians themselves, do they feel like they're prevailing now with the onset of Donald Trump? And what does that mean for the position Iran finds itself in?
Right. Well, it's interesting because there are kind of a few different geopolitical situations that are unfolding at the same time. On the one hand, with the winding down, or at least seemingly the winding down of the conflict in Ukraine, Russia finds itself in less need, as I said, of the Iranian equipment, or maybe even Iran as a strategic partner on evading sanctions now that there are talks of potentially, canceling out some of these sanctions. That's one thing. But then also, what happened last year in the Middle East with the defeat of the Iranian proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon, and of course, the toppling of the Assad regime in Syria, which Iran supported. Iran's sort of standing in the Middle East has changed as well, and so I think Russia's with that comes it becomes less of an interesting partnership for Russia, which also tries to kind of hold on to its um, standing in the Middle East, as we see now with their attempts to negotiate the remainder of their two military bases in Syria. So there are negotiations with the new government, and I guess Syria is actually one region where you can clearly see how the convenient partnership between Russia and Iran begins to crumble the moment that their interests in the region diverge.
Would that relationship of convenience be altered once again now that we're seeing the reemergence of sectarian violence in Syria? How does that impact this relationship of convenience that you described between Russia and Iran?
That's a very good question. And in fact, I'm working on this story right now with our partners, the Center for Peace Communications. And I've spoken to them earlier today. We're working on the story about the Alawites, the ethnic cleansing that happened in Syria in recent days. And so what's been interesting to see is how Iran and Russia have played different roles immediately following the reports of the massacre that took place. It appears that, uh, according to our partners at CPC, Iran has been playing a role in sort of, you know, using the Alawite cleansing as a political tool to drive a wedge in Syria and to kind of divide and conquer, as they put it. So to use the Alawite cleansing as a pretext to sow discord and regain their foothold in Syria, which has been lost after the toppling of the Assad regime. You would imagine that Russians would be similarly sort of, screaming about the genocide of the Alawites as an example of, look at all these reasons why toppling the Assad regime was bad. Now the new government is, ordering the ethnic cleansing. But remarkably, the Russian state media and the official statements have been very mute on the subject. And again, I think it points to the fact that Russia is really trying to cooperate with the new regime in order to maintain their military bases. So while Iran is sort of driving and fomenting the sectarian war in Syria in an attempt to regain foothold, Russia so far attempts to kind of present itself as a diplomatic negotiator, who is kind of above this whole situation. So it's interesting how their roles really diverge here, and once their interests diverge, they sort of lose that sense of partnership.
Wow, that's really interesting and very important work that you're doing there. Now, I have two important questions there. Number one, um, are the Iranians causing the sectarian violence itself? Did your reporting find that, or are they just taking advantage of what is happening and trying to get back their stronghold in the region there?
It's a little bit unclear so far. We've been conducting interviews with the Alawites and other witnesses in the region. What appears to have happened is there was first the insurgency of the some of the, you know, still uh, loyalists to the former Assad regime who first um, attacked a number of general security forces outposts on the coastal region of Syria. And so that drove a response from both the Syrian government forces as well as these sort of like this militia, including the Syrian National Army, the Turkish-based group that is not very loyal to the new government. But so it's unclear what role exactly Iran is playing and whether, they are just using the existing conflict and spreading disinformation about it as a means of trying to regain foothold, or whether, there were reports of the Hezbollah fighters either coordinating with some of the militia that was responsible for the Alawite ethnic cleansing, or in other ways involved. It's kind of, we're still in the middle of trying to figure out what exactly happened there. But there's been a number of reports that suggest Iranian indirect, at least, involvement in this.
Wow. And do you suppose what is the reasoning behind the Russians not supporting the Iranians in this effort as they have in the past with their partnership in Syria when it was Bashar al-Assad? Is it because they do want to appear to be this, diplomatic mediator for Donald Trump now and emerge as being relevant on the world stage in that sense? They want to have relevance?
Yes, that's one of them. Again, they have the military bases there that they are dying to preserve. And, of course, if they go against the current government, there's no chance that that will happen. So they have their own narrow regional interests. And then, yes, as you said, the relationship between Russia and the US seems to be changing quite rapidly. And so within that realm, Russia tries to position itself sort of, in a way that it could reopen doors for Western integration, because Russia was kind of cut off from the Western world rather sharply in 2022. Before that, before the full-scale invasion, it was a very sort of Western-oriented country that had had all different kinds of diplomatic, economic, financial ties with Europe and the US. And I think perhaps, I can only speculate here, but I would imagine that Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, perhaps is seeing certain openings for potential restart of some of these, um, communications and the lift of sanctions, which is obviously crucial for Russia now that its economy has been significantly strained in the past 3 years of war. So potentially that also plays into Russia's actions in Syria right now, and them going against, or at least not following Iran's lead in the region.
And Iran is very weak right now. It's very isolated. I mean, 2024 was a very, and going into 2025 was a very bad year for Iran. I mean, you had the Israeli airstrikes knocking out their S-300s. Their proxies are severely weakened. They're not completely out, but they've been defeated in many respects, Hezbollah and Hamas. And then domestically, they've got domestic unrest. They've got the energy crisis, the economy, the real is falling. Is Iran now kind of desperate for support from Russia? And will Russia use this and use Ukraine and the ceasefire agreement as leverage against the United States to put more potentially diplomatic pressure on Iran and go towards diplomacy versus kinetic options that the U.S. has?
That is again, a great question. At this point, we can only guess, but I would imagine that that's a very likely scenario, given that, again, I think their roles between Iran and Russia has sort of changed. And if 3 years ago, Russia looked up to Iran and felt like it needed Iran more than potentially Iran needed Russia, although they do share certain ideological worldview in the sense of pushing the anti-Western ideology, kind of trying to remake the world order along with China and North Korea. But at the same time, the roles have reversed a little bit, and at this point, it appears to be the case that Iran needs Russia more than Russia needs Iran. And so, yeah, it would be interesting to see how the as Russia, develops, uh, as the year progresses. I would say how it would be interesting to see how the roles change and how the alliances change. I will point out that I saw during preparation for this talk, I saw that Iran and Russia have signed a treaty earlier this year in January, and many touted it as the sort of the new chapter in the collaboration between Russia and Iran. But if you look closely, the treaty does not include, for instance, the provision of mutual help during in case if the country, if either of the country is being attacked, the other country is not um, sort of obligated to join or send forces, unlike you know, what the treaty that Russia signed with North Korea, where they said there is a mutual assistance clause that exists there, but it doesn't exist between Russia and Iran, which suggests that they are not, exploring military cooperation at least, and that their ties are rather limited in general.
I guess it also suggests, like you were saying earlier, but a lack of trust between both sides.
For sure.
And you've definitely got even a history of the two countries being foes for, for many years.
Right. The suspicion is pervasive. I think it's mutual, as you said. And yeah, the moment the interests, as I said, stop aligning, the suspicion seeps in.
And you mentioned Iran and Russia's shared anti Western rhetoric. We actually had a guest on Eye for Iran in our last episode, Henri Barki, from the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. And he said no matter what, there is always going to be some sort of alliance or partnership between Russia and Iran, even if it is limited, because Russia knows Iran can be a bad actor and cause troubles for the Western world. And they always want to keep that in mind and also share that same ideology. What do you make of that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the same with similar type of relationship exists with Russia and China and Russia and North Korea, where, they will remain partners simply because they share this. They want to remake the world order. They do not agree with the US being the superpower that has such an influence in the world. You know, Putin is famous for his anti-globalist rhetoric, and I think that rhetoric is often shared, in Tehran or Beijing. So, in that sense, I do agree that some sort of partnership will exist. If not partnership, that at least some understanding between the countries will exist for these ideological reasons.
Now, what is Putin's endgame when it comes to the Middle East, particularly Iran? Like, what does he want at the end of the day?
I mean, I wish anybody anybody could know with any level of certainty what Putin's plans are anywhere in the world, but from what we can surmise, or at least from the strategy that he's been pursuing in the region over the past decade, with when Russia kind of interfered in the Syrian civil war, and they went on the side of the Bashar Assad. Similarly with in conjunction with the Iranian forces. Um, you would say that, Russia wants to maintain not only presence in the Middle East, but to have sort of a series of strategic partners in the region that are it helps if the governments are critical of the US, or at least are not partners or allies of the Western countries, which was the case with Assad. So in that sense, the Syrian war could be viewed as one of the proxy wars that Russia is leading in its effort to remake the world order, as I said. Um, Ultimately, the end game is hard to predict, but from what we can surmise, it appears to be just the remaking of the world order, where Russia has a larger standing and the US is weaker than it is on the world stage.
Let's talk about Israel and Russia and how that fits into Russia's endgame in the Middle East. Just last week, Russia invited an Israeli delegation to its May 9th victory parade. However, Iran was not invited. What did you make of that? And just how significant is the May 9th victory parade for Russians?
First May 9th Victory Parade may be the most important federal holiday that has, it has acquired an added symbolism after the Ukraine invasion, the idea of Russians defeating the Nazi, because one of the propaganda lines that Russians have been fed since the early days of the invasion is that Russians are not fighting Ukrainians, but they're fighting the Nazis in Ukraine. And so the victory in the Second World War has acquired a whole new propagandistic um, use for the regime. So Victory 9 parade, May 9th Victory Day parades were important as a symbolic measure when I was growing up, but in the last 3 days, they have reached a whole new level of symbolism. It is incredibly important. Putin attends those parades himself on the Red Square. It is also an added display of Russia's prowess in the world. It's a PR move, but whom he invites to these events is also very telling in terms of Russia's standing in the world and the allies. I think in the past 3 years, there were hardly any, if any, maybe none of the Western nations that have attended the parade, while in the previous years, definitely when I was growing up, I remember, European leaders and the American leaders would join. In recent years, I believe it may have been some of the South American and South African countries that have been coming there. I would have to double check that. Don't quote me on that. But in other words, who gets invited to these events is also telling us of Russia's alliances or Russia's, geopolitical desires. And the fact that Iran hasn't been invited this year, where Israel has been, I would imagine you'd have to choose between Israel and Iran when you decide whom to invite. You can't, it's hardly feasible to have both. So I think maybe this is Russia's way of strategically shifting their alliances now that Iran, as I said, becomes less of an important strategic player for them. Whereas Israel, as a major US ally, might be sort of, an interesting player to kind of reshape the relationship with now that Russia appears to be moving closer to the US in the context of a potential deal in Ukraine.
Based on that answer, what is the trajectory of Russia then?
The trajectory in terms of like just on the world stage, hard to say. I hope and pray that the ceasefire deal gets accepted. I know that Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, is planning a visit to Moscow for a meeting with Vladimir Putin this week. Um, Again, the ceasefire deal that has been reached in Saudi Arabia between the US and Ukraine hinges on Russia accepting it. I have seen some war reporters and state-affiliated actors on Telegram expressing their discontent with the ceasefire deal and sort of urging the president to reject it, which is not very surprising given that's the type of rhetoric that you would expect from them. That not to say, I don't want to read too much into it. We'll have to see what happens with the meeting. I can only hope that the deal gets accepted and people will stop dying. I would like to believe, and maybe that's a naive view, I would like to believe that Russia should be seizing every opportunity it can towards Western reintegration and towards stopping the slaughterhouse and the bloodshed in Ukraine first and foremost. Um, I would like to see 2025 being the year where Russia becomes again more of an open European society that I remember during my upbringing. But that's just my hopes.
And do you think that with the, onset of Trump and these shifting alliances, like you said, and this message that obviously Russia is sending to Iran by inviting Israel and not inviting them to this May 9th victory parade, which you said is critical to their, your upbringing into the society in Russia. Do you think that's an indicator that, yes, indeed, Russia is moving closer to the West?
I mean, yes, if they pick Israel over Iran as their guest, honorary guest during the upcoming celebrations, then for sure, symbolically, it is, at least a PR opportunity for Putin to appear next to Netanyahu or whoever comes from the Israeli delegation and say, look, we are, having a dialogue with international partners. And again, Israel is a major ally of the US. So perhaps that's also a message to the broader Western society to kind of, take stock of Russia's different position and differing positions on the world stage.
So does Russia's moves does it give us a window into the different shifting alliances and where things are headed? Does Russia kind of give us a clue based on their actions?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, again, I would be very wary of trying to predict the moves of Vladimir Putin or read too much into the symbolic gestures like this. But again, these symbolic gestures are of high import to him personally, and to sort of the wider idea of where Russia stands in the world. So yes, by all means, these actions, speak volumes in terms of Russia's ambitions.
And tell us a little bit about yourself. I understand you were a producer on the Oscar winning documentary Navalny.
Yes, well, I didn't they were great they graciously gave me that credit, for, some of the work that I helped them on. But yes, I was born and raised in Moscow. I came to the US 13 years ago now for, college and sort of never left. I, studied film and TV, and so I went into documentary world first and then found my way sort of through documentaries, into video journalism, which is sort of where I've been. I've begun my journalistic career by covering the war in Ukraine. Actually, when it first started, I was with the Wall Street Journal, doing video investigations, about the Russian army's war crimes in places like Mariupol and the Kyiv region. Then I worked, for other publications like Semaphore, and currently I'm enjoying my time at the Free Press, where I cover Russia, Ukraine, but also the Middle East. Yeah, very much enjoying the ride, as they say.
And you still travel back to Russia, and you're still in touch with people there, both as, obviously your family, but as a journalist too.
Yes, I've, completed my lifelong dream this past January when I, for the very first time, reported from my hometown of Moscow, for the Free Press. I've long dreamed about reporting from Moscow for some Western publications. That's been always a goal. I wish the circumstances under which that was happening were different. I wish my country was not in the middle of the war it launched. But nonetheless, it was an incredible opportunity. Of course, one has to be incredibly careful these days, as you probably are very well aware, when reporting for the Western media from places like Russia or Iran for that matter. Um, but nonetheless, the experience had been incredibly rewarding. And yes, I tried to go back home, to visit my parents at least once a year, sometimes a couple times a year.
And I know you do travel back to Russia and you do have family there, so I don't want to put you in any kind of bad position or awkward position. But if you can answer this, what did you make of the scene between Trump and Zelensky?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't I don't know if that would put me in any sort of weird position necessarily. Um, well, I think that the Trump's behavior in the White House was appalling. I think that putting Zelensky on the spot like that in front of, the world's press had been just an incredibly wrong move that is bad for diplomacy and is counterproductive, not conducive to any sort of diplomatic efforts. I was stunned that the, on-camera appearance lasted for 49 or 50 minutes. Usually, these things take 5 minutes most, and then you go behind closed doors. But at the same time, you know, I also think that Zelensky could have played it smarter. I think that first of all, he should have used, the help of the translator, as many people pointed out, because when you are relying, on a translator, you have a time to cool down and think about your responses, and also use the very precise language, instead of I think that part of the role kind of was started by simply being lost in translation, or, Zelensky not being able to express himself as accurately
That's
or
a
as
good point.
specifically as he
Sorry to
wanted.
interrupt you there
Yeah.
because at one point I think Zelensky said to Donald Trump that you have a nice ocean, but soon you will feel it. And Trump said something along the lines of, don't tell me how to feel. But I don't think he meant feel in terms of emotions. I think he just meant that, what is happening over there eventually will make its way to the Western world as well. And people in general will feel it.
And Trump took it as a threat, which was completely not what Zelensky intended, and I think that was a perfect example of the place where the translator could have smoothed the edges. And again, it would have just given Zelensky and Trump both time to think and kind of, respond with cool and level-headedness more so than they did. And then also, you don't discuss the specifics of any deal in front of the media. This media opportunity is just for smile, shake hands, and show the world that, you are with your biggest strategic ally here. You he's Zelensky's Ukraine sort of, in major way depends on the US for military aid, for intelligence sharing, for financial support. So, to begin discussing the details of the deal, such as, the security guarantees that Zelensky insists on in front of the journalists, during this kind of media op, I think was also a strategic mistake on Zelensky's part. But again, I think, Trump should not have put him in that position.
Let's talk about how that meeting and how it went viral, obviously, the impact that that had or is having on Russia and Iranian relations. Like, for example, the Iranians came out and said, see, this is why we're not going to be able to talk to the Americans. They use that as an excuse, for example.
Oh, interesting. I did not see that. That's very interesting. That makes perfect sense, though, because I would assume they're looking for any excuse they can to avoid having conversations with Trump when, they know that there's no love between the two. There were, I think, a number of assassination attempts by the Iranian government to on Trump during the campaign, and Trump is aware of that. So nothing good could come basically of that type of meeting. So, using the spat in the Oval Office between Zelensky and Trump is a perfect excuse to, you know, not wrongly say that the US president can sometimes be too much.
Just as a final kind of concluding question, with everything that we've discussed today, this whole kind of access between Russia, China, and Iran, do you see that kind of in some ways withering away?
Potentially, I think that the conclusion of the war in Ukraine may be one of the nails in the coffin. But as we said earlier, I think that some sort of strategic partnership between the countries will always exist simply because they share a lot of the ideological worldview. But on other points, um, I do see, specifically between Russia and Iran, the ties are waning in certain areas. I feel in case of China, Russia still depends on China quite a bit. And China is a much bigger economy, and geopolitically, I would say in many ways it finds itself in a much stronger position than Russia right now. So that type of relationship, we'll have to see. But with the Ukraine war hopefully again winding down, I think that this partnership will be rethought and these ties will undergo some changes in the near future.
Going back to that meeting between Zelensky and Trump, and President Trump essentially accusing Ukraine and Zelensky of being the aggressors, when the typical worldview is that no, the Russians have been the aggressors in this case against Ukraine. Was that in some ways, some analysts are saying that he said that and was, kind of mirroring what Putin is saying this whole time, because he believes that he can get something out of Putin by essentially giving Ukraine away. Is that something potentially Iran?
Potentially. I think for Trump, he really wants to be seen as the peacemaker. We remember, in the previous administration, the Abraham Accords was one of the big touted achievements of his administration. He wants to put an end to the war in Ukraine, which he believes is unwinnable. And, thinking more as a businessman than a world leader, let alone the American president, he may be thinking more about the strategic sort of economic and financial ties with Russia, um, and kind of putting the moral aspects of having a deal or, giving Ukraine away kind of on the back burner there a little bit. Whether Iran could be part of it, I think hard to say, but potentially, potentially as well.
Thank you so much. We had a great conversation. That's Tanya Lukyanova from the Free Press.
Thank you so much, Nagar. Great to see you.
If you like this episode, hit the like button, leave us a comment, we'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.